Yeah, but you're not going to be in transit for the next 7 months.
No. But it's convenient.
Sure, no, yeah.
It's only 10 hours of flying.
Really?
9, 10.
Yeah.
And also, it's Japan.
Which is cool. Yeah, that's what I meant about a hard sell.
Yeah.
It's gonna
All
be,
travel is expensive right now.
yeah, but Japan, yeah, like you said, getting into Japan might be a problem. How long did it take you to get here?
A week.
With your paddle boat?
I was in London last week, so
Oh, okay.
that took 30 hours. 30, 35?
Ugh.
I don't know. Too many.
Boston to Japan is easy. There's lots of direct flights. Well, there used to be lots of direct flights. It used to be a 767, 11 hours, but who knows what they're doing now. I will move the mic closer. How, is that any better? All right. People have stopped coming in. Let's get started. Share pre-loaded slides. All right. Welcome to the penultimate session of IETF 114. Penultimate is one of my favorite words. When my wife says, "Did you take the last donut?" I say, "No, I took the penultimate one. There's one left for you." Anyhow, if you haven't already signed in via the MeetEcho thing, please do so. Obviously, here, Daryl is remote, as is Mark Nottingham. Can people on remote hear me better?
I can hear you fine, but I wasn't having a problem before.
Right. Okay. This is the note well. If you haven't seen it before, it's because you've been late to all of the other meetings or your eyes weren't open yet. Be good to each other. Don't hide patents. We have a process. We have a process. So and so. Meeting tips. Everyone should know this by now also. Sign in via MeetEcho. If you're in the room, there is a take the mobile phone app, sign the QR code that's on the back halfway through the room or outside the room. If you're remote, please keep your audio and video off until you're speaking. And it's too late to go out and buy a headset now, but next time. We have an agenda. It was posted. It's in the data tracker. Again, if you're just learning this stuff now, it's probably too late. So just watch and raise your hand if you want to talk. Okay, we need somebody to take notes. Thank you, Martin. Yeah, okay, we don't have to explain how to take notes. Martin's an expert. All right, next topic is agenda bashing. I think we're going to be done early, so I don't think we need to shuffle the agenda around. And if there's other topics that come up under any other business at the end, I do think we'll have time to do that. But does anyone have any concerns about the agenda? Okay. Roberto, are you ready?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Thanks.
Yep. I can
So,
hit the next button or we can pass control to you, whichever you prefer.
no, please, it would be great if you can
Yep.
move on the slide. So,
Okay.
everybody, rate limit header is almost complete, as we editors think. Please move on. The goal for this draft is to communicate service limits so clients can stop before being throttled out, and the basic goal was to align all the already existing fields and stop header proliferation. So we didn't want to invent a new way of doing things, just to consolidate the shape in which something already happened. And we added another field to express limiting policy. Move on. So on the left, you can see what's currently on the web, and on the right, the three new fields that we have in our case, with additional field with a policy um, that is instead a structured field with many items. Next, this is the shape of the actual field. I think you already know that. Next, and let's go to what the technical choices is to implement a design similar to retry after and using structured fields. And we don't want to mention infrastructural concepts like connection because you don't know how intermediaries implement this kind of infrastructures. So maybe you can have rate limit fields, but connection can be aggregated, multiplexed by intermediaries. So you could not rely on the concept of connection using rate limiting fields. Next. We added privacy configurations, and we got a lot of interesting exterior fields, thanks to especially Mark Nottingham and to all the folks that supported the specification in the recent period. Next, and so we have currently two open issues. The first one is not to allow rate limiting fields on trailers because no one uses them and it's way too complex to define all this behavior. The idea is that if tomorrow someone wants to extend rate limit to trailers, is welcome to do it. And then the only step between us and the last call is that the proposal of combining all fields in a one structured field. Next. Well, we have been asked to do it, and we tried to accommodate this request. There is a long, maybe a mailing list thread, but me and Alex finally decided not to support this change. This is because almost all platform and middleware decided to use in time, and this practice has more than 10 years, to use separate integer valid fields, so there is no operational experience in providing and consuming this information in combined form. When we try to combine information in one single field, we were asked to separate them because implementers found that confusing. And an important thing for what's the current API ecosystem, structured field parser are not available in current off-the-shelf tools, like, for example, HTTPD, Nginx, or API gateways. And in general, we do not advise processing non-bare item structured field with regap. So we try to accommodate this request, but the current API ecosystem, current implementers, current consumers, and current products do not support well this kind of change. So our opinion is to be consistent with the original goal of this specification and try to consolidate a long-standing practice to provide something that has value for current implementers. I think that in the future, if the current ecosystem changes, we could be open to make a new specification for rate limiting fields and providing a way of combining the information. But in this case, we think that the result would just be to have another standard that nobody uses. So the first goal for us is to consolidate the current ecosystem around a specification. In the future, if implementers feel that there is some operational experience and provide feedback, a positive feedback on a combining field, we can make a rate limit bit, maybe, but currently I think this is not an option. We want to gather and join all the implementers, existing implementers, under one hat. In the future, when we'll have this one consolidated community on rate limiting fields, if the implementers feel, or if the work group thinks that the ecosystem is ready for an updated specification, we will have a consolidated group of implementers of this specification, of this spec, and we can move the consolidated community to a new, improved, maybe, field. But today, we think it will just be confusing. So next, but I think I'm finished.
All right, let's take some time and discuss this issue because in the chat, there's some contention. So Mark, you want to go?
It seems to be working. I don't know. So, Roberto, I understand your arguments here, but it's just not appropriate to have, make a decision that is made on arguments or on data that is not brought to the working group by the people making the arguments. That makes me really uncomfortable. I think we need to have a discussion as a working group and talk about the pros and cons and make a decision as a working group, not just have the editors say, well, we've talked to a bunch of people and we think that it should be this, therefore we made this decision. So let's do that, please. Okay.
Mark, sure, I don't want to overstep the freedom of decision of the working group, clearly. On the other side, we have been asked to investigate, try to accommodate, and we did it. And honestly, the result we had was this one. So surely the work group is free to do and to propose another solution. But we did our homework, and this was the result. So I just don't want to. I just wanted to clarify that we try to accommodate this request, and we think that in the future we have no objection to move that to a structured field. What I am not sure that is the right thing to do is just to have structured fields as a goal. In my opinion, structured field is not a goal per se. The goal here for the original goal for this specification is to consolidate a standard and avoid proliferation. It is not to force anyone to adopt structured fields, even because we don't have the force in this case for pushing structural fields in an ecosystem that is currently not ready for that, because we don't have products. So
I think we can separate the structured fields from the combining of
I
fields.
didn't want to say we as the editor decide. Absolutely not. But we have been asked to investigate, and we did it. So we wanted, if there is some, some other ideas, to me it's fine, but I think it should be based on some data or some feedback, not just on legitimate thoughts.
So Martin's in the queue. Maybe we'll let Martin go ahead.
I think I just broke a chair. So I think I want to concentrate on what the real arguments are here. I think Roberto.
Hold the mic.
Yeah, I've got everything in my hands. Is anyone? Yeah. Okay. So I want to focus on the goal here, which is to express this information in a way that people can use. And I think that this debate about structured fields is really the nub of it. I honestly find the spelling of this information across 3 fields to be a little odd. But there are aspects of that make me think that maybe under certain circumstances, having separate fields could be somewhat advantageous, in the sense that there's this reset field, for instance, is stable where the other ones might not be on a per request basis. So I'd rather concentrate on those sorts of arguments than these. Like Mark, I'm a little uncomfortable with the way this is being argued and seemingly decided. I think this is at some level the editors work for the working group and need to try to capture the decisions that are made here. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of people here who are contributing to this discussion, so that does make it kind of difficult. That's going to be hard. hate taking them out.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else on this topic? I think it's certainly something we have to bring to the list and discuss. All right, Roberto. Oh, hang on.
Julian was joining the queue.
Yes. Go ahead, Julian.
Hello. I think it would be really interesting to understand what kind of support in things like NGINX and HTTPD actually is needed. Because, I mean, if there was a actual ticket I could look at, for instance, for HTTPD, I could get people to consider actually adding that support, but just saying it's not there without saying what's actually needed is, I think, a bit weak. So what is the actual API or tool support that would be needed to make structured fields acceptable here?
All right, we're gonna just, Mark has asked, and we'll take 2 votes. First is, do you have an opinion? Raise your hand if you do have an opinion on this, and then we'll ask what the opinion is. And this is not the whole structured fields discussion. This is 3 headers versus 1 header. Pull request 65. All right. I'll close the vote in a few seconds. So for the benefit of the recording, which doesn't count this, 17 people participated, 11 said they have an opinion, and 7 have no opinion. This is out of roughly 40 participants. So end the session. And now we'll have another one. It doesn't have to be just the 11 people who said they have an opinion. 3 headers or 1. Good point. Yes, let's just skip that. There we go. So raise your hand basically if you support the editor's decision to have 3 headers, and do not raise your hand if you prefer to see it merged into a single header. Couple more seconds. Please raise or not raise your hand as you are willing. All right. So 13 participants, 7 raised, 6 not. So we clearly do not have consensus yet, even rough consensus. In spite of that, Martin is wordsmithing the field names to be even more terse. Yep. Rafat, please.
So just quick question. I don't have an opinion here. Just want to understand, like, for the people that proposing that we merge this, what's the rationale? What's the reason behind that?
And the race is on. Martin, you can go first.
Mark?
Okay, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah. Is it working yet? It's working yet. Okay.
Yes.
I'll let Martin give his opinion, but for me, it is there's an aesthetic aspect to it. There's a kind of a don't repeat yourself. It's the having it in 3 headers is very repetitive. There's questions about how they interact, and generally in HTTP we have we don't spread things across multiple headers unless there's a good reason for it, and there are sometimes good reasons for it, but I don't see any here. I think the most probably the biggest reason though is that if we're going to specify these as structured fields but make them look like they're just simple integers and simple so that, and really the draft currently downplays the fact that they're structured fields, and this was discussed quite a bit in the issue. It's a bit of an attractive nuisance in that people will say, oh look, it's just an integer, I'll just parse it as an integer, and that'll break if people ever add an extension or a parameter to it, for example. And so it's kind of like leaving something around that people can hurt themselves with if you're not careful. And so if you don't want it to be a structured field, if you don't want people to use structured fields parsers, that's fine, but don't specify it as a structured field. And if you're not going to specify it as a structured field, I think the expectation in the IETF is that you will specify parsing and serialization to at least as high a level as structured fields does. So if that to me, I think is the path you'd take if you want this to be 3 headers, is say, okay, you specify a parsing and a serialization algorithm for each one that's bespoke. But there's not a great reason to do that because we already have these algorithms defined. I don't see a strong argument to go off and have bespoke parsing algorithms for these headers, and I don't find the arguments for putting them into 3 headers convincing at all. I just don't. Martin, you go.
That was a lot. I'm hoping to capture all of it. So I agree with everything Mark said. I also think that in this case, this can be a lot more efficient and simpler in the sense that it is an atomic unit at the point that you have everything together. And splitting across multiple fields means that you need to go looking in multiple places for the information. I personally think that this is much easier to process from a usability perspective. Having had to do that on the GitHub APIs, this would have been better than what they have.
Any other discussion on this issue, which is clearly open and the working group has not decided yet?
I'll add a comment speaking as an individual. One of my concerns about rate limiting headers always has been the practice is to, once you support returning these rate limiting headers, you return them basically on every response. And I think there's a burden on the client and the burden on the network to transfer those things on every single response. And the simpler that we can make this from a processing perspective on the client side, the better. And having just one header to parse, I think is easier and simpler.
Okay, the argument, excuse me, here is that I think that if it would be simpler and easier somebody else would have done it, in the sense that the actual widespread implementation provides three fields. So this happens independently on what we may argue about what's more efficient, because implementers do it in another way. Maybe everybody is wrong and they didn't do their due diligence in defining their way of implementing fields. But I think that, like Brent said in the last meeting, that there is value in what an community of implementers do, and this is done from more than 10 years. So again, I would like that the argument for combining fields were substantiated in some implementer community, in some implementation, where, for example, Google and Facebook says, okay, we think that it's more convenient to combine all the fields. So we changed the way, and we think that other implementers, just like Digital Benefit, are doing it in the wrong way or in the less efficient way. But actually, we do not have the I do not have the force of forcing the deployment of single field in a wide ecosystem and test and provide a study to demonstrate on real data that one single field is better than I think that following the common practice is a value because it's a long-standing practice. And the goal for this specification was not inventing a new way of doing things, but to provide a common ground for different implementers of the same in the same on the same ground. I mean, on the same specification.
Question for you, Roberto. From a client's perspective, is it possible for implementers to use these fields in isolation? For example, like, is the remaining value of any use to me without reading the limit?
You can probably just use remaining and reset values to shape your policy. But in my experience with the implementers I know, those values are used in different ways, depending on the kind of interaction. So in some cases, they use even the policy even the policy values to make forecasts, for example. In other, they consider that requests can be multiplexed, so they assign each couple of triple of fields to different users from a single client. The goal really is here to standardize the semantic of fields, not to define a way, a stringent way of how using them, because the way that clients and server can shape their traffic can be different, actually. And for example, I saw one of the questions from Mark. It is possible that an intermediary process those fields and changes them if this is internal to one infrastructure. So yes, there is the possibility that one gateway receives some fields and lowers them, for example, depending on how many services this gateway is servicing. So the possibility to mangle these fields is different both internally, one infrastructure, and on the web. And in case, for example, an intermediary is processing those fields, the fact that there are no libraries inside of the shelf products that can process them easily if they were just one field combined, it's not trivial.
All right, we're going to close the queue on this. Obviously, we have to have discussion on the mailing list. Encourage, please, people who were involved in the API community that aren't commenting to either comment in the pull request. Remember, the working group decided to use GitHub and or the mailing list. Let's figure out, as Spencer would say, let's make good decisions. So, Roberto, move on to your FAQ.
Yes, well, you are already, I think, it's the fourth time. Well, it's a couple of years that this spec is lingering around, but I think we are done with this presentation.
Thank you, Roberto. And so do we want to move on to the media types presentation?
Sure. Next. So we are trying to register some media types to increase interoperability when processing API specifications such as OpenAPI and leverage content negotiation. One of the goal of this specification is not to disrupt current implementation and respect the engaged communities such as YAML, JSON Schema, OpenAPI, and JSON-LD. Next. So YAML and JSON Schema, for example, have not been registered, and this makes content negotiation for this kind of document non-interoperable. And moreover, YAML does not have interoperability and security considerations. Next. We have different goals for this specification, but the YAML LD was moved to the W3C work group that is working on JSON LD. So for this presentation, we just focus on YAML and plus YAML structure syntax suffix, because on OpenAPI and JSON Schema, we still have a lot of work to do. Next. We added a lot of things. We forked the YAML in another draft, and we almost completed the YAML media type registration with security and interoperability consideration, fragment identifiers, multi-document YAML streams, and strengthen efforts with YAML community. For REST APIs, as I said before, there is still a lot of work to do. Next. On YAML, I think that the document is ready for our group plus call. We have just some fields that we can discuss. The first one is the more controversial. Is about the plus YAML media types to use the same YAML fragment identifier. Then there is suggestion, we can take it or not, to reference Unicode security consideration for YAML, but I think this is very similar to what could happen in JSON. Happy to get feedback on that. And the issue 59, the YAML LD media type asked us for normative conversion algorithms from YAML to JSON. And well, we have to engage with media type mailing list clearly. Next. So this is one of the points. Should every plus YAML media type use the same fragment identifier of application YAML? Yes, Alexei, we will register the plus YAML suffix together with YAML. So the proponents says that structured syntax suffix are a way to implement list of substitution principles. So if something is valid for application YAML, it should be valid for any plus YAML media type. We think that this can affect future media types. For example, JSON schema plus YAML or linked data plus YAML already well, for JSON schema, they already define a fragment identifier specification. So if they were forced to use the same application YAML fragment identifier, this means that it will be impossible to use to register JSON schema plus YAML using the same fragment identifier as JSON schema plus JSON. And this for us is showstopper, because we really want that, since there are already usage on the internet for plus YAML media types, even if they are not registered, we do not want to break this implementation. Moreover, the 6838 does not require that plus YAML and YAML have to have the same fragment identifier. So since this is not a requirement, I think that I would favor the ability for new implementation to use YAML to extend the syntax with respect to define different media types, or to have inconsistent implementation between something plus JSON and something plus YAML. But we are open to suggestions here.
Could I ask a question, Roberto?
Yes.
I'm not sure. I don't know that I've seen this on the spec, but I sorry, in the discussion, and I did see it. This conversation about if you use plus YAML, you have to support the native. Is this SSS fragment ID, and the one mitigator to that might be, for example, OpenAPI plus YAML. OpenAPI's use of YAML is limited to what YAML calls JSON schema, not to be confused with the thing that is called JSON schema. YAML has this other concept that says you can only use the things in YAML that will round trip to JSON. Now, my question is, does that prohibit using anchors? Because if that prohibits using anchors, then you won't be able to use that native YAML fragment ID.
Well, there are some points. For example, the YAML, the JSON schema that is defined into YAML is not really compatible with JSON because it supports, for example, +inf and
Right,
NAM that are not supported values in JSON.
Okay, but that feels like just an error in the YAML spec. The intent of the JSON schema is to be fully round trippable. So the fact that there happens to be an error there doesn't negate that fact, right?
Yeah. Well, I am not sure that probably this was an error in the YAML specification, or maybe that they just used the JavaScript way of using JSON. I mean, probably JavaScript implementation supports those fields, while JSON doesn't. But
Okay.
the point is that you can define a fragment identifier in OpenAPI. In OpenAPI plus YAML. As of now,
which fragment identifier? The JSON pointer one or the native YAML one?
The native YAML one supports JSON pointers when it starts with /.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So you can say, for example, that in this way, if we do not enforce that OpenAPI must use application YAML structured syntax suffix, we can say that OpenAPI defines its own fragment identifier as JSON pointer, and then OpenAPI plus YAML or plus JSON is free to decide its own fragment identifier, even if it can be different from the one that is defined in application YAML. Since the content type or the media type of this file is not just YAML, application YAML, but is OpenAPI plus YAML, it is a different media type that can potentially have different behavior from the just application YAML. And as a matter of fact, structured syntax suffix allows to define its own fragment identifier. Okay, the point is that we should be careful here just because we are not defining a specification in Greenfield. There are implementation, and I think that we should be careful in not hindering the ability to use something like schema plus YAML or OpenAPI plus YAML, because people already uses it. That says that we should write something that matches the current implementation. In other cases, if we were to write a new specification, I think that we were free to define whatever we think appropriate. In this case, we should be a mediator from different communities, JSON schema, OpenAPI, YAML communities. Sure, they write it, they implement it. So happy to listen to your opinion here.
But I think your last point about RC 6838 is probably the strongest item there. So what do you need to be able to close this issue?
Agreement. My opinion is that if the community thinks that we do not need to define a structured syntax suffix in plus YAML and just currently we just state that if you want to use application YAML, you should explicitly write it down. So if you tomorrow we define OpenAPI plus YAML, if we want to use the full-fledged application YAML, we should write it down. So for OpenAPI plus YAML, we want to see application YAML. If we don't want it, we can write or use our current specification that already exists, as far as I know, in OpenAPI.
Roberto, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Sure.
I am completely incapable of following what you're saying here. So can you write down something for the notes, please? I've been really struggling to parse what you've been saying. And I'm mostly following along, but that last little bit, I completely lost you.
Yeah.
Could I have an attempt at paraphrasing?
Sure.
There is a mechanism that application/YAML has available for fragment identifiers that uses its native anchoring type support. Existing media types or existing formats like OpenAPI and JSON schema, when they use YAML as their format, tend to use JSON pointer and basically squint and look at the YAML document as if it is a JSON document and use that to reference elements in the document. And because they are only using YAML sufficiently to describe a JSON document, they don't use any of the fancy features of YAML, and therefore JSON pointers are sufficient. The suggestion that Roberto is saying is just because application/YAML uses this fancy format, it doesn't mean that plus YAMLs have to do it. If they want to support this fragment identifier with the anchors, then they can explicitly say in their media type registration that they support the format, the fragment identifier that uses anchors. Did that help at all?
That was immensely helpful. Thank you.
And I think because what you're saying, Roberto, that 6838 doesn't require that they need to have the same fragment ID, then I think being explicit in media type registrations as to which fragment identifiers are supported seems to me like a very viable solution and solves the problem. Mark?
Working? Is it working? It's working. Yeah, usually the pattern is to have the default be the common application/YAML in this case fragment identifier syntax, so that registrations with the plus YAML or whatever it's going to be do the right thing. That if the people forget or they're lazy or whatever, that there is still a fragment identifier syntax that is sensible for that format available, but they can opt out of it. So that's without knowing too much about the specifics here. I have no idea what SSS is, for example, but that's the general pattern that I've seen in the past, I think.
Okay. I don't even think it's worth having a hum on this. There's still we still need to have some discussion on the list. So And Daryl is nodding, so let's move on to the next slide, Roberto. Sure.
Okay, this was a request coming from the YAML LD work group in W3C. They wanted to have a normative way of converting YAML to JSON when it is possible. I think it's a hard stuff, and probably we could enrich the normative considerations. Excuse me, the interoperability considerations, to defer this to the YAML specification, or we can define another draft, either under the IETF or other organization umbrella. But I don't know. Maybe you think that it's something we must have a way for converting YAML to JSON in this specification or not. The point to me is that I wanted to release this specification as soon as possible because we needed to continue the work for OpenAPI. So I want to work with the OpenAPI specification on something that has some ground.
I will just comment. I'm not sure I'm allowed to voice an opinion here, but as an individual, I would defer this to the YAML spec. The YAML spec is attempted to define a way to limit YAML usage that was compatible with JSON schema. If you're saying that there's holes in there, let's go ask them to close those holes.
I think if we tried to define a conversion, it's not in our charter, and we'd have to confirm with the area director that they really would let us or want us to do that. Okay, let's continue.
Thank
So,
you for your time.
Chairs, do we have a resolution on that one?
Do we have a resolution on this PR? Well, we know that, I think the answer is no.
Okay.
If the author, if there are people who I'll put it this way. If there are people who really think this working group should address 59, please bring it to the list and we can discuss it. But as of right now, I'm fairly positive it's outside the scope of our charter.
Yeah, I totally agree. This seems like a massive mistake for a media type registration to start defining this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, Roberta, you can, unless you feel strongly about opening up the charter question, you can just close this PR and say it's out of scope. All right. Daryl, you want to go through the board?
Sure. So to address the other working group documents, I'm going to share my screen once I remember where the button is. There it is.
Martin, I think this last two discussions weren't quite what you thought you were signing up for, so thank you.
So before we get into these items, the one document that is not on this list, because there are no open issues, would be 7807-BIS, which has gone through working group last call now. I think the only open question on that to Mark would be, do we need a new rev of the document?
I'll have to go and check that. We do have finally a pull request, much belated, for a JSON LD context as an appendix, but there's been a fairly robust discussion on the details of that, and it doesn't look like it's actually been resolved yet. I don't know enough about JSON LD to comment whether it's good or not. So as an editor, I'm a little concerned about incorporating it without wider review. And I'm still not sure that it's actually necessary to put it in the specification. But some people seem to want it. So as a non-normative thing. Any guidance from the chairs?
I guess my question would be why if JSON LD want to do a flavor of HTTP problem, why does it need to go into the HTTP problem specification?
My understanding is that this is basically a mapping of the data structure in a problem detail to something that looks like, that is compatible with or understandable by JSON LD. Although I wonder about extension members and how they'll be handled. But yeah,
couldn't it be in a completely separate document that just references 7807-biz?
That, to me, yeah, I wonder that. And I haven't had a good answer as to why it needs to be in the spec.
Okay. Eric has joined the queue. Eric.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody, this is Eric. Yeah, about JSON LD. So it's not so much about JSON LD, right? In the end, JSON LD is a mapping mechanism to interpret JSON as RDF. And I think that's where the problem is, because if you specify the mapping into RDF, you have to settle on an RDF vocabulary, right? Because essentially that's what you will standardize, the RDF vocabulary that the JSON gets mapped to. And I think this is why it's so hard for the commenters to come up with something, because just putting in some JSON LD mapping, so to speak, is not good enough, because, well, you can use JSON LD for any JSON. That's not the point. The point would be to say this should be mapped to this RDF vocabulary, and then everybody agrees on, okay, in RDF, then this is what 7807-biz looks like. And I think this is also because we had those discussions in those last open issue, right, around, well, what terms should we actually use? And personally, I don't think that this is going to be resolved anytime soon, because in the end, that would be a discussion in the RDF community, how they want to define those standardized vocabularies. And I'm not sure that this community will be able to come up with an answer in the next couple of weeks or months.
Thank you. That's actually really helpful, Eric. It makes me more concerned because we're going to put this in an immutable RFC, and I have less confidence that what we put in there is going to be the right thing. So
yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you. That's actually very helpful then. So I think we'll close that one down a little gracefully, and I'll check. I think we probably do need to have another draft issued, and then we'll go ahead and progress the document if the chairs think it's ready.
Sure. Yeah. Unless there's does anyone in the room or online feel strongly about JSON LD and now therefore RDF being included? Great. Okay, Mark, you have consensus. Go for it.
Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, so moving on to deprecation headers. So I think, Eric, you're back up. There's a couple of issues that are minor document update required. There's one that is in discussion, and it was just waiting for a comment from Julian. with regards to redirecting. But the big issue is what started out as a conversation is use structured fields and turned into, hey, why don't we just completely redesign this API, this HTTP header to a completely different thing? So Eric, do you want to just give us what the current state is there? Or Mark, do you want to jump in ahead of time?
I'll go first.
Okay, go ahead.
There was a long discussion in the GitHub issue, and I don't want to kind of rehash the whole thing. I think what we have ahead of us now, right? And that it's great that we have this meeting so that maybe we could also have like a poll around that, because I really would like to know what people are thinking. So the draft as it is now has been written kind of to be in line with the sunset header field, which has been an RFC for a little while now. And that was kind of the motivation to have something similar for deprecation, and it also uses the same syntax, right? And then a little while ago, there was an issue proposing that instead of using that syntax, which may not be great going forward because it's harder to parse than some other syntax, we could switch to structured fields, here they are again, and use structured fields instead. My feeling was that it would be better, even though I agree that the structured field way is better in a vacuum. But since deprecation and sunset are pretty closely related, my takeaway was, I think it's better if those two fields work the same way and use the same syntax. So this is kind of where the first decision would need to be made. So right now, the draft still is using the sunset syntax, which is the ISO date format. And in that issue that Daryl, I think, is showing here, there's a long, if you're interested, right, you can look it up, but it's a long discussion. And then at the end of the discussion, right, we also get, and that was I think there was an idea that kind of at the same time Roberto and Mark had, and I like that idea, but I'll get to the catch. The idea would be to say, well, what about having a generic header for lifecycle information, which would be able to express sunset and deprecation and maybe other lifecycle stages as well, saying like this is experimental, or possibly other lifecycle stages you could distinguish for APIs. And then that header would just be called something like lifecycle, and it could have different timestamps in it, and it could always use structured fields, or anyway, always the same syntax. And that would make it easier to have one place where the lifecycle info is going. So I kind of like that idea. What I don't like is that this would basically mean to start from scratch. So that, I think, in my mind, is the downside. And I think there also were some people voicing concerns that, well, how many other life cycle stages are there? Do we really need like a kind of a more complicated header to begin with? Wouldn't it be good enough to have sunset and deprecation? So what I would like to do, if that's possible, would be to maybe have people voicing their opinion between what is more desirable: syntactic compatibility to the sunset header that is already an RFC, or being compliant with structured fields, which is kind of a more forward-oriented way of representing data information, but it would not be compatible with sunset. So that would be the first poll. I think that would be interesting to see what people are thinking. And then the second one would be, what about just ditching the whole idea of having a separate sunset and deprecation header field and creating a new draft about lifecycle info, which probably would obsolete the sunset RFC, but that would be a lot of work, and I'm sure that would take another at least year or two, right? As we all know, these things don't move too fast. So that's my concern, that I think I have heard people saying, hey, when are you finished with deprecation? So I think it would be good to actually have something out there. But there is this idea that we could also do something that is a little bit more forward-looking. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
We're waiting for Daryl to get back online. There he is.
All right, just lost connection. I am back. Mark, you're up. We see you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Separate from this, whether or not it's a structured field or not, I find the idea of a life cycle header really intriguing. I think it would be really nice to have one place you can go and look and find about the status of the API you're interacting with and where it is in its life cycle. So that to me seems like really nice rather than having it spread across multiple headers. I don't think that it would take a long time to make this change. It's just syntactic. It's just shuffling some text around. We do this all the time in the IETF. The hard part is the concepts and the semantics. The easy syntax is always fluid. So I think we could do this in just a pretty quick PR. So yeah, I'd like to see things go in that direction. Just from I don't know. It seems intriguing to me. Regarding the structured field stuff, I think I and a lot of other folks would like to see headers being adopted as structured fields wherever possible. I think there's kind of a growing number of people who have a prejudice that if something isn't a structured field, there should be a really good reason. But if the reason is compatibility with Sunset and we decide to go that way, then fine. What I'm more interested in getting feedback from this working group is and I'm now going to hijack this session. Thank you very much. In the HTTP working group, we're talking about adding a date type to structured fields as part of the retrofit draft. And we're at this decision point because the retrofit adds structured equivalents to the date header and the expires header and the last modified header, which are all dates. So now is the opportunity to introduce a date type if we're ever going to do that. And so the HTTP 1.1 serialization of it could look like an ISO date, with an @ sign at the front, as discussed in the PR, or it could be an @ sign with just an integer after it, representing an epoch, second since January 1st, 1970. And what I'm asking for here is feedback on, if we defined a date type in structured fields, would that make it more interesting to use structured fields for cases like deprecation and other things in this working group? So far, the discussion in the HTTP working group, my reading of it is that people think that the textual representation should probably just be the @ symbol is the sigil to denote that it's a date, and then an integer after it, which is not as human friendly, but it's easier to parse and serialize, and a tool can reliably recognize that thing to present it in a human friendly fashion if need be. So any kind of feedback that people had would be super, super helpful. And if people here don't want to use it, if that's not interesting in whatever form, that's good information to take back to the HTTP working group too. So I'm done hijacking. Sorry. Please return to your normal flight.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it would be very, very useful to have that. I think we also, part of a long thread in that discussion about deprecation is the same kind of thing, right? Like, is there even a concept of a date type, and it's not. So I think having that type would be very useful. Doesn't matter whether we use it for deprecation or lifecycle. I would say we would definitely use it if we go the lifecycle path. But regardless of that, I think even other header fields, it's highly likely that they will use some kind of date time information. And if that is something that you can specifically define and say this is not just string, it's actually a date time, I think that would be very helpful.
Eric, do you want to jumping topics? Because Julian commented in reply to you in the chat, suggesting that we could just start with sunset and deprecation and deal with extensibility at a later point in time. Would that mitigate your concerns about the time it would take to introduce a registry and so forth for extensibility?
Oops. Is my audio on? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, good. I think if we choose to go the lifecycle route, I think it would make sense to really design it in a way that it is extensible. And if we want to make it extensible, we need to come up with some extensibility model, and it probably will be some kind of registry-based thing. And I don't think we can wiggle our way out of that one. I mean, either we say this should be future-proof, then we have to think about how we want to make it future-proof. If now we just say there can only be 2 fields, then I would say, why even make the change? Just stick with sunset that's there, and just finish deprecation as we have it. It's sitting there. We could just approve it. So
I misspoke. Julian was suggesting having an extensibility mechanism, but I'll let Mark speak as he joined the queue.
Okay. Sorry.
Mark.
Okay. I'm going to disagree with Eric there. I think it would be super, super easy, because if it's defined as a structured field, then it's going to be either a list or a dictionary, and that is naturally extensible. And you don't need a registry. All you do is that the next time you want to add one of these things, you have another RFC that updates this one, and it adds a new value. That is the simplest extensibility model in the IETF, and we do it all the time. You only need a registry when you need uncoordinated extensibility, and I don't think that's the case here. I think we'd want to come to consensus the next time that we define something. So it's super, super, super easy.
Super easy in IETF terms. Here, let me add myself to the queue. One comment, Mark, about the dates, going back to the date thing. You say integer plus epoch. I have experienced working with teams where they've said they've used integer fields, and then there's the question of, well, what is your origin time for the epoch? And my understanding is there are different origin times floating around for epoch. Now, maybe that's just because I spend too much time in the Microsoft world, but is that a problem that other people have seen? What is the epoch origin? You said 1970, but I've heard other dates.
Just specify
it. Yeah, it's not in the message though, right?
No, but it's in the semantics.
Eric, you suggested you would be interested in a poll with regards to interest in the life cycle. Rich, do you want to do that?
Sure. How do you want to phrase the question?
Votes for. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my recommendation is to first ask, should we just move on with deprecation as we have it, because it's finished pretty much. So we could just have it if we want to have it. And would that be good or not? Just finishing deprecation in one way or the other. And then the second question would be for those who, sorry, I misspoke. So the first question is, should deprecation be syntactically aligned with sunset, or should it be something else that is supported by a structured field? So that would be the first question. Assuming that we keep deprecation separate, I think that would be interesting to figure out. And the second then would be, or should we stop this idea of having a separate deprecation header and instead shoot for like this unified lifecycle header field that can have multiple of those lifecycle stages in it, and we would just start maybe with sunset and deprecation as a starter set. Doesn't look like we'll get to a statistically relevant result here. Or I could say twice as many want it that way.
I think we're seeing a bias for the for an answer on the second question.
Yeah.
That is very well possible. Yes.
Let's try the other question.
Daryl, you
Yes,
want to type
sure.
it in to the show of hands tool? Upper right corner of the bar graph.
Yep.
Cool.
Let's see if I get. I probably should have said replacement as opposed to alternative. Okay, we look fairly stable at 12 participants, 9 saying, yes, we should explore the use of lifecycle as a alternative to sunset and deprecation fields, with 3 saying not raising their hand. So there is enthusiasm for that proposal. I don't know, does that count as consensus, Rich?
It's going to have to be confirmed on the list, not because there's not a lot of people voting. Yeah.
Yep. Julian's in the queue. Go ahead, Julian.
Hello?
Hello.
Okay. I know that Martin and Mark were very unhappy about the first question. Maybe they should explain that themselves. The question that I have is, if we are concerned about consistency between these two header fields, do we actually have any data about adoption of sunset and how many people have actually have cursors for that would be reused? Just asking.
So maybe I can jump in here. So it's not a scientific poll. I've seen sunset being recommended in some API guidelines here and there. It's not that everybody uses it, but it's something that I've seen adopted, at least in some places. I have received a few, not many, but a few questions around deprecation, asking, hey, when is this ready? We would like to make that part of our guidelines. We're not sure if we should reference it because it's just a graph. So I would say at least there's interest. I don't know how much adoption of sunset is out there. I think for deprecation, there's probably none because it only has been floating around as a draft, and maybe people don't feel confident enough. But for Sunset, there is some adoption. That's the only thing I can say. Oh, and Microsoft is using it. Okay. That's always good to know.
Okay. You've heard feedback from the people who are present in this room, Eric. I think, as Rich said, it would be good to take this to the list and get a broader sense of interest in creating a consolidated lifecycle header. You might find that the interest for it is significantly more for that.
Okay, I'll do that. At least I'll ask, and then I see it. I have to admit, right? I put a lot of effort into the deprecation thing. It's kind of sad to see it, and I'm not quite buying Mark's thing that it's just a simple little edit. But anyway, that's not a discussion we have to have now. But okay, that's fine. At least I'll write a little note to the mailing list so that we have the discussion there, and then we can see what that leads to.
And just to confirm, Julian's asking, currently in the spec, it's an ISO date, right? Not an HTTP date.
Yes, currently it's the same as Sunset because that was the original idea that both would use the same syntax, and that's the current status. But there is this open issue that I think was raised by Mark.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you for all that information on the deprecation header, and it's been a good conversation. Moving on to item potency, I don't believe Sanjay is here. So unfortunately, Eric, you are the sole person in the room attached to this specification. I believe from what I've seen, most of these updates are fairly minor. Do you have an idea as to anything that is blocking these changes from going into the spec and us being able to move towards last call?
To be honest, I haven't looked at this one in a while. It's true there are no formal blockers in there, but yeah, I can't tell. I don't think that it's ready for last call. I think it would probably take a little bit of effort to kind of reread through it and see where we are. But
okay, I can reach out to Sanjay because I know it was expired last in IETF 113 and it did get updated. So
yeah, but I think mostly I think just to have a non-expired version, pretty much.
Okay. I'll talk with Sanjay. And sorry to go back to an issue that maybe I confused. Julian is saying Sunset uses HTTP date. Is that correct? I thought it used ISO.
I think that's the same, pretty much.
No.
It is?
No.
No.
I hear a lot of...
So when we say HTTP date, we mean the bizarre syntax that's used in the date header field, and the ISO one's the year-month-day that you're using in the draft. The other one's like Wednesday, blah blah blah. Yeah,
It is not best practice.
It's Wednesday, blah blah blah. I think because that's what Sunset is doing.
Right. So that's not ISO.
Okay. In that case, it's not using ISO.
Okay. Julia?
Yeah, okay. So in which case, although I would prefer to have ISO everywhere, the fact that they use the same format as HTTP date is of course a good reason for keeping the consistency, because although it's a very broken and bad format, that at least has browsers everywhere. So the current state is we are not inventing a new date representation. We keep the HTTP one date field value syntax, which I think is the cheapest thing to do right now.
Okay, so if I think what you're saying is if there is a decision to stay with the two separate headers, then you agree with Eric that consistency between the two headers is good, and we should not actually introduce an ISO format. Okay.
So I think if we don't do structured fields, then the current state of things is the right state.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Julia. Okay. Which is link template. And of course, Mark has his structured field thing. Are there any reasons why you wouldn't go with a structured field there, Mark?
You know, there are the same discussions about consistency. I personally think that it's not that big of a deal if there's small inconsistencies, especially because we noticed in the retrofit draft, we're defining a structured version of the link header, and so we can just reuse that syntax, and so that's very nice and straightforward. So I'll probably do a PR for this and have folks have a look at it, and we'll see how it goes. That, and I think someone raised an issue. Yes, should the anchor parameter also allow a URI template, which is an interesting thing that I need to think about it a bit more. But it seems reasonable.
I will say this idea of being able to define a link template that can work for collections of things has been an issue that has come up quite a bit in the past in the open API world.
Cool.
Okay. So the other documents are the media types and rate limit headers, but we have already covered those. Unless, Roberto, you have any other issues here that you wanted to bring up? I'm assuming not.
No, I think not.
Okay, excellent. Which then I believe brings us to, just a, Martin, do you have any updates on your explorations around the date header and where that might live?
Yeah, so we had some discussions in the OHI working group earlier this week, and we essentially concluded to take the pieces of this work that are relevant to that and take it there, and probably I'll abandon doing anything more generic. So, I mean, there's some stuff in there that's interesting, but I don't think it's really worth pursuing.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Eric just brought up an excellent point that we should mention the fact that the link set document has now been published. And I'm sorry, Eric, I did not bring cheesy fireworks, but it is very exciting to see the first document from this group go all the way through the process.
Yes, congratulations to the authors and also working group comments. So hopefully the first of several. I won't say many, let's say several. All right. Okay, so with that, any other business that people want to bring up to the working group? All right, thank you everyone for your participation. We're at the end of our IETF 114 meeting. Hope to see many of you in London, on the mailing list, in the PRs, on video. Take care, travel safely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go grab a last cookie if you're in here.
My mouse is now captured in the screen share, so I can't do anything. How do I get it out?
Just close the tab.
I can't get out of this
Yeah.
the screen share to do anything. Ah, there we go. I don't know what I did.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Um, all right.